The last thing I remember before everything changed was the sound of my own key scraping against a lock that would not turn, and the strange, cold relief I felt when it didn't. My name is Carolyn Whitfield. I am 58 years old, and this is my true story from Sacramento, California. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 14 months earlier, I had buried my husband Robert after 31 years of marriage. He ran the hardware store on Fulton Street, the kind of place where men still shook hands over paint colors and lumber orders, and I kept the books in the back room every evening after the register closed. When the cancer took him, it took the store with it. What the insurance did not cover, the sale of the business did, and within a year the life we built together existed only in photographs and in the smell of sawdust that never quite left my clothes no matter how many times I washed them. I moved into the smaller house we had once rented out, the one with the crooked mailbox and the maple tree Robert always meant to trim but never got around to. At 58, starting over is not a phrase people say to your face. It is simply a thing that happens to you while you are busy grieving. I took an evening position doing patient intake at a medical billing office 2 towns over, work that required long hours and a clear head, and paid just enough to keep the lights on and the property taxes current. The office did not run a late shuttle, and my son Michael, who had moved to Oregon for work 3 years earlier, was the one who installed a rideshare app on my phone before he left, entering his own card number just in case, he said, though we both knew what he meant was in case I refused to spend the money on myself. That is how I met Manny. He was the driver who picked me up most nights that first month, a man in his late 50s with a quiet, steady way of talking, the kind of voice that did not require you to fill silences just to be polite. His car was clean, his rating was near perfect, and something about the calm way he adjusted his mirror before pulling away from the curb made me trust him before I had any real reason to. I gave him my address the first night, and he repeated it back once, softly, like he was memorizing something important rather than following instructions. Over the following weeks, Manny became the only person I spoke to face most days. My co-workers were kind but distracted, my neighbors were strangers behind closed blinds, and Michael called when he could, which was less often than either of us wanted to admit. Manny never asked questions that felt like small talk. He asked things that mattered, and then he waited, without rushing me, for whatever answer I was willing to give. One night, without planning to, I told him about Robert, about the store, about the silence that now lived in my house like an unwelcome tenant. He listened the entire way home, and when he dropped me off, he waited at the curb until my porch light clicked on before he drove away. I did not think much of it then. I thought it was simply good manners. By the second month, I had started bringing him coffee in an old thermos of Robert's, the same one Robert used to carry to the hardware store on cold mornings. It felt strange at first, handing a stranger something so personal, but Manny accepted it with a kind of quiet gratitude that made the gesture feel right rather than foolish. He told me, in pieces over several nights, that he had once worked as a machinist at a plant outside the city until an injury on the line ended that career and left him with a limp he tried hard to hide. Driving nights let him set his own hours, which mattered because his elderly father lived alone across town, and Manny checked on him every single morning before allowing himself to sleep. He spoke about his father with a patience that reminded me painfully of Robert, and I found myself looking forward to those 20-minute rides more than I looked forward to almost anything else in my week. It was Manny who first noticed the sedan. We were 3 blocks from my house on an ordinary Thursday when he slowed the car and glanced in his mirror longer than usual. "There is a car that has been parked on your street the last 2 nights," he said, older model, dark green, no plates that I could read clearly. I told him Sacramento was full of cars that never moved, old sedans left by neighbors who could not afford to fix them, and he nodded without arguing, though I noticed he did not speed up right away either. A few nights later I mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that my garden gate had been left unlatched, something I never did, not since Robert installed that latch himself the summer before he got sick. Manny asked, quietly, whether anything inside the house seemed different, and when I said no, he did not seem convinced, though he did not push the matter further that night. By the 3rd month, Small things had begun to accumulate in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like a pattern I did not want to name out loud. A folder of old billing statements I kept by my phone for reference went missing from the kitchen counter, and I told myself I had simply misplaced it during one of my late, exhausted evenings. Manny did not accept that explanation as easily as I wanted him to. He began asking more specific questions: which nights I worked late, whether I had noticed anyone waiting near the intake office parking lot, whether the same faces kept appearing on my street at hours when no one had any obvious reason to be there. I found his attention almost embarrassing at first, the way you might feel when someone takes your safety more seriously than you take it yourself, but I answered his questions anyway, because some quiet instinct in me had started keeping its own private list of things that did not add up. What I did not know, and would not learn until much later, was that Manny had begun keeping notes of his own, dates and times and descriptions written into his phone after he dropped me off each night, not because he suspected anything specific yet, but because years earlier he had ignored a pattern that mattered, and it had cost him something he was still not willing to speak about in detail. He had promised himself, quietly, that he would never make that mistake again with anyone who trusted him the way I had started to trust him. He did not tell me this yet. He simply kept watching, kept noticing, kept waiting for the moment when instinct would either prove itself wrong or prove itself exactly right. That moment arrived on a Tuesday in early spring, the kind of ordinary evening that gives no warning of what it is about to become. I stepped out of the billing office at 11:15, later than usual because a system outage had delayed the last of my patient files, and Manny's car was already waiting at the curb, engine running, headlights low. I climbed into the back seat, handed him the thermos out of habit, and expected the familiar right turn 2 blocks ahead that led toward my street. Instead, he continued straight, merging into a lane that carried us away from my neighborhood entirely. I asked him, gently at first, whether he had simply missed the turn. He did not answer right away, and in that silence I felt something shift in my chest that I can only describe now as the beginning of real fear. "Carol Ann," he said finally, "I need you to stay calm, and I need you to trust me for the next few minutes." My stomach tightened in a way it had not tightened since the night the hospital called about Robert. "Where are we going?" I asked, and he told me somewhere quiet, somewhere we could talk without anyone watching us from the street. He pulled into the empty lot behind a shuttered garden supply store, cut the engine, and turned to face me fully for the first time since I had known him. "Do you know a man named Walter Briggs?" he asked. The name meant nothing to me at first, and then, slowly, it did. I had seen it once, months earlier, on an old billing dispute file that had crossed my desk and then quietly disappeared before I could finish reviewing it. Manny explained that he had driven a man matching that description several times over the past 2 months, always late at night, always drinking, always talking too loudly on his phone as though the back seat of a rideshare offered any real privacy at all. He said this man had mentioned a woman who worked billing intake, a woman who was careful but slow, a woman who lived alone in a house with a crooked mailbox on a street he described with uncomfortable accuracy. He said the man had mentioned Tuesdays specifically, the night the office ran short-staffed, the night my house sat empty longest. My hands began to shake in a way I could not control. "He knows my schedule," I said, though I do not know why I said it as a question rather than the statement it clearly was. "There is more," Manny said, and his voice had lost the calm steadiness I had come to depend on. "2 nights ago, before I picked you up, I drove past your street on my own time, not for a fare, just to check. His car was parked directly across from your house, engine still warm, lights off, and I watched him walk up to your porch and try your front door before he noticed me slowing down and got back into his car. The world seemed to tilt sideways in that empty parking lot. He tried my door," I whispered, and Manny nodded once, slowly, as though saying it out loud made it heavier for both of us to carry. "I am not taking you home tonight," he said, "and I am not asking your permission. We are going to the police station right now." We arrived just after midnight, and the station smelled the way I imagine every police station smells at that hour, like burnt coffee and old paperwork and the particular exhaustion of people who have seen too many ordinary nights turn extraordinary without warning. I told an officer everything: the missing folder, the unlatched gate, the sedan that never seemed to leave, and my voice cracked more than once as I said it out loud for the first time to someone whose job it was to take it seriously. Manny handed over his phone, his notes, the timestamps he had recorded without ever telling me, and I watched the officer's expression change from polite patience into something closer to genuine concern. A detective joined us within the hour, a tired-looking woman named Detective Reyes, who asked careful, specific questions about my work at the billing office and about any files I might have reviewed recently involving disputed settlements or contested claims. When I mentioned Walter Briggs by name, something shifted visibly in her expression, and she left the room briefly before returning with a folder of her own. Briggs works contract security at 2 of the medical facilities tied to your billing office, she told me, which meant he had access most employees never questioned, badge clearance that let him move through hallways and file rooms without raising suspicion from anyone who assumed his presence there was simply part of his job. Then she told me something that made the entire night collapse into a shape I had not expected. Briggs had once worked alongside my husband Robert, years earlier, at a supply company Robert had briefly partnered with before opening his own hardware store. Robert had reported irregularities in that company's inventory billing, irregularities that led to Briggs losing a contract worth a significant portion of his income at the time. Robert never mentioned the name to me, not once in 31 years, likely because he considered the matter closed the moment he walked away from that partnership. Briggs, it seemed, had never considered it closed at all. When he recognized my name on billing paperwork years later, tied now to a widow living alone with a predictable schedule, the situation became, for him, an opportunity rather than a coincidence. Detective Reyes explained that officers were already preparing a warrant for Briggs's home, his vehicle, and a storage unit registered under his name. Manny stayed beside me the entire time, saying little, simply present in the way he had always been present during those quiet rides home. 2 hours later, Detective Reyes returned with news that made my hands go cold all over again. Officers had intercepted Briggs less than a mile from my street, his car already turned in the direction of my house. Inside his vehicle they found printed photographs of my front porch, my garden gate, and handwritten notes describing my evening schedule in detail that no stranger should have been able to assemble on his own. In the weeks that followed, the investigation widened further than any of us anticipated. Briggs had not acted entirely alone, and federal investigators eventually connected his activities to a pattern of altered billing files affecting dozens of elderly and low-income patients across 3 separate facilities, small adjustments to claims and settlements that most victims would never have noticed on their own. My accidental discovery of one disputed file months earlier had apparently been closer to the truth than anyone, including me, had realized at the time. Briggs, it turned out, had been quietly correcting his own tracks whenever a new employee got too close, and he had assumed, wrongly, that a quiet widow working intake would be easier to intimidate into silence than to outmaneuver through paperwork. The trial took place nearly a year later, and I testified on the 3rd day, describing the missing folder, the unlatched gate, and the night Manny refused to take me home. Manny testified the following morning, calm and specific in a way that left no room for the defense's attempt to paint him as an overly suspicious driver imagining danger where none existed. When the recordings he had saved were played for the jury, the room grew still in a way I will never forget, the particular stillness of people realizing they are listening to intention rather than imagination. Briggs was convicted on every count brought against him, fraud, evidence tampering, an unlawful attempt to enter my home with intent to intimidate, and the sentence handed down ensured he would spend the remainder of his working years, and many beyond them, behind walls rather than behind a badge. I still live in the same small house with the crooked mailbox, though the locks have been reinforced and motion lights now line the walkway Robert always meant to fix himself. I still work nights at the billing office, now under far stricter oversight than before, and I still ride with Manny most evenings, though these days I sit up front instead of in the back seat. His father passed peacefully several months after the trial, and Manny has, since then, slowly begun rebuilding a relationship with a son he had been estranged from for years, a son who reached out after reading a brief mention of the case in a local paper and recognizing his own father's quiet courage in it. We have dinner together most Sundays now, an arrangement neither of us planned but both of us have come to depend on in ways that surprise us. I think often about how differently this story might have ended if I had never offered a stranger a cup of coffee from my late husband's old thermos, or if Manny had decided, as so many people reasonably do, that a passenger's private troubles were simply none of his concern. Kindness did not save my life because it was extraordinary or heroic in the moment it was offered. It saved my life because it created a connection between two people who might otherwise have remained invisible to each other, and that connection created attention, and that attention, in the end, created action. We live in a world that often teaches us to keep our heads down and our routines predictable, to treat the people who serve us quietly and briefly as background rather than as neighbors. I am living proof that paying attention to another person, and allowing another person to pay attention to you, can matter more than either of you will ever know in the moment it happens. This was my true story from Sacramento, California, and I hope that wherever you are watching from tonight, you remember that the smallest act of noticing someone can, quietly and without warning, become the reason they are still here to tell their story at all.